Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In his first year in office, President Biden has made a pattern of nominating extreme partisans and radicals to serve in the administration, but especially to serve on the bench. And unfortunately, that pattern continues today. Mr. Ho, you will not be surprised that I want to address some questions to you. And in my view, your record reflects that same pattern of finding someone who has been an extreme partisan, who has been a radical, and President Biden trying to put judicial robes on that partisan and radical agenda. And I would note at the outset that that's not just my characterization. You yourself have described yourself as, quote, a wild-eyed leftist, and further as someone, quote, accused sometimes of seeing discrimination everywhere you look. Is that right?
Senator Cruz, I think the key word in that quote is accused. What I was doing...
Let's start with the first one, wild-eyed sort of leftist.
Well, again, Senator Cruz, I think I was characterizing how others have caricatured myself.
Okay. Well, let's take a quote you wrote in November 2017, and I found it amusing, the exchange a moment ago with one of the Democratic senators about, some older intemperate statements. I would note, just sitting here, this may be a first in that you have tweeted attacks at multiple members of this committee, including Senator Lee, Senator Cotton, Senator Blackburn, Senator Cornyn, and far from being intemperate statements when you were a teenager. Most of these tweets occurred last year. So in the last 12 months, you have engaged, or the last about 18 months, you have engaged in partisan attacks on multiple members of this committee. But you also wrote in November 2017, quote, in these dark times, I've been fortunate to find tremendous sense of purpose in my work as a civil rights lawyer. But as a colleague of mine asked me over lunch recently, Dale, do you do this because you want to help people or because you hate conservatives? What he was getting at is that anger can, in fact, be a tremendous source of power. For me, righteous indignation can provide a sense of moral clarity and motivate the long hours needed to get the work done. But it's only a short-term burst. It's not sustaining in the long run. Mr. Ho, if you wake up and are Judge Ho, and I recognize that New York is a blue state, but imagine there is someone who considers himself or herself a conservative in the state of New York, who, God forbid, finds themselves in a courtroom where you're wearing a robe. What comfort do you think that litigant would have that you described the hatred of conservatives, the righteous indignation, the anger at conservatives, as a tremendous source of power for you personally? How does that possibly give anyone comfort that you would be a fair and impartial judge?
Thank you, Senator Cruz, for giving me an opportunity to address this. As I mentioned to some other members of the committee, this was a comment that I made in church where I was relaying a joke that someone else had told, the point of which was that that kind of temporary sugar rush from being angry at someone, while it can feel powerful in a moment, it's not the kind of thing that is sustaining for a human being in the long run. That at the end of the day, if you want to do good work in the world, it has to come from a different place, a place of love for your fellow person. And that's what I was trying to convey to my fellow congregants at my church.
Well, that's not what you said. And what you said is you described hatred and righteous indignation directed at conservatives. And I would note that that's a pattern that also continues. A minute ago, you talked about how you're dedicated to equality. And I will say, looking at your record, that is not, in fact, the case. Your record, instead, is a partisan view. So, for example, you are a graduate of the Yale Law School. The Yale Law School has an open policy of discriminating against Asian Americans. One of the first things that Joe Biden's Justice Department did was dismiss the investigation against Yale because today's Democratic Party believes discriminating against Asian Americans in admissions is an acceptable form of bigotry. Do you agree with the Biden administration on that?
Senator Cruz, I haven't followed the ins and outs of what the Biden administration has done with respect to that particular matter. What I can tell you,
Do you agree with your alma mater's policy of discriminating against Asian Americans in admissions?
Well, Senator Cruz, I'm a member of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association. I try to do what I can in the Asian American legal community. I'm not aware of a particular policy of discrimination in admissions at Yale Law School. But I think to your larger question, Senator Cruz, I clerked for judges who were appointed by executives of different parties. They set an example for me that politics, you can have political views, but they don't have a role on the bench. And I would look to follow their examples.
Well, your record suggests precisely the contrary.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin, and thank you to all of today's nominees for your willingness to serve, for your records of service, and to your families for their support of your nominations here today. With your forgiveness, I hope, I'm going to focus specifically on the nominee to be the head of the Patent and Trademark Office. You've had a number of questions from my colleagues. I'm going to briefly address 2 or 3 things. There's lots of other issues I could take up, but I know that my colleagues will competently continue to engage in the concerns that motivate many of us here on this committee. Ms. Vidal, if I might, just first, congratulations on your nomination to this important and challenging position. I think it's crucial for us to have a Patent and Trademark Office director who understands the values of patents as a means of incentivizing innovation and who can advocate effectively for balance, for strong enforcement mechanisms, both domestically and internationally. And if confirmed, I look forward to working with you. This is an area that is of great interest to me and a number of other members of the committee on both sides, but doesn't quite hold the attention of everybody in our society and on our committee all the time. I wanted to briefly talk to you about 3 issues, if I might. First, in December 2019, as you know, there was a joint USPTO, Department of Justice, NIST policy statement on standard essential patents. I think standard essential patents, particularly in the current world, in the ways in which technology is moving quickly and is developing, are critical to innovation. And I support that 2019 policy statement. I'm concerned there seems to be a move to reconsider it and possibly weaken it in terms of the remedies available. Would you commit to keeping an open mind about whether any revisions to that 2019 statement are warranted?
Absolutely.
And would you commit to a transparent process that includes input from Congress and interested stakeholders if there is any movement towards making changes?
Absolutely, Senator.
Thank you. One of the things I'm most concerned about, and I know this brings together folks both sides of the aisle, is state-sponsored IP theft, particularly from China, but from many other competitors. And international cooperation on intellectual property policy, I think, is a critical issue. The previous administration at the PTO actively engaged the World Intellectual Property Organization and the International IP Committee in what I thought was a critical move towards protecting IP rights. And so I think the next director has to continue to engage with foreign partners that share our core values in order to ensure there's real multilateral cooperation on IP issues. Please tell me and this committee, if you would, briefly about your experience and your perspective on the global fight over IP protection.
Thank you, Senator Coons, for that very important question. Part of the reason I'm here today is because of that activity. When I was asked whether I would be willing to serve in this position, I thought long and hard about whether I could make an impact and whether there was progress to be made. I think there's a lot of progress we need to make on the international front. There are, as you mentioned, there's theft going on. There are laws in other countries that are not transparent. They're not predictable, and it puts U.S. innovation at a disadvantage. In terms of my own personal experience, I have certainly represented U.S. industry against counterfeit goods, against infringing goods from other countries, and I have a wealth of experience in that area, and have found it very challenging when the laws are not balanced, when the laws are not fair, and the laws are not equitable. So I would be very heavily engaged in that, Senator.
Well, I look forward to working with you on that. You've gotten questions from a number of my colleagues about Section 101, about patentability, about the FinTIV factors and PTAB initiation. Is there anything remaining on those two areas that you'd like to speak to today before we conclude?
Not on either of those two areas. I know that, with 101, I would just say it needs more clarity, and I would look forward to working on that. I think with FinTIV, it's an issue that warrants additional consideration, and there are a lot of comments, and I would look forward to working with you on that as well.
Okay, we've got, in my view, a lot of work to do. I do think legislative reform is required in Section 101, and I think it's going to be very difficult, very elusive. And I think making sure that PTAB continues to strike the balance to protect strong patents, but to also provide a pathway towards review of improvidently granted patents is exactly one of the areas that I think you may make a great contribution in. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, thank you. Ms. Vidal, thank you. And to the other nominees, thank you. I look forward to supporting your confirmations.
Thank you, Senator Coons. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief because a number of my other colleagues are waiting to ask questions, but I'd just like to say how impressed I am with not only the talent and dedication of this panel, but also the diversity. And I am a former prosecutor myself. I was Attorney General of my state for 20 years and the United States Attorney in Connecticut, but I'm glad to see that we have the defense bar represented and that the experience that you've had, life's experience that you'll bring to the bench is diverse as well. I think one point that is often underestimated is the significance of temperament and perspective. On the district court, you will be the voice and face of justice for most Americans. Most litigants don't get to appeal to the Court of Appeals, and when they do, they're often not there in person. And your temperament, your patience, as you well know, because you have experience in the courts, will be tested many times by litigants. You've seen them. But I just want to congratulate every one of you, and I look forward to your service on the bench. I'll